way. She's flying to Dublin. We have Piotr Koster, who's one of Europe's top speakers, and he is going to be giving us a workshop today on extensions. So I won't keep you any longer. Piotr, if you just want to go ahead, thanks for coming.
No worries. Would it be possible to just slightly change the angle of the laptop so I can actually see people? Because I just see the top of people's heads. And whereas I do like seeing people's hair, I like seeing their face just slightly more. Okay, great. Let's see. If I'm going to share my screen, I need to have a request to be able to share my screen in the first place. Okay, great. Let me see. Just to double check, if I now start the slide
Yeah, that's perfect.
this,
Well,
you should be. Oh, actually, it doesn't. It's fine. I'm sorry. Fine. You now see the full slide, right?
yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, I have been asked to give a workshop on extensions. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to give you a bullshit philosophical take on what extensions are or should be. I think you should all kind of like know by now what extensions are. I'm just going to give you a couple of methods on how to come up with them. Given this is also a 15 to 30 minute kind of like workshop, normally I would do a lot of like exercises in between. What I'll do is I'll just ask a couple of questions before I'll like give what I have done before, so you can think of that way. But I won't do them as like a deep thorough like exercise, and then we discuss them together because I don't think we simply have time for that. So I'm just going to give you overall three kind of like ways to look at like extensions. The first method is going to be the many impacts method. The other one is just going to be better incentive slash capacity method, and the other one is going to be just doing the opposite of what your opening does. There's one thing that I really want to vouch for, and it is try to bring only one extension. I have seen teams try to bring two or three extensions, and what tends to happen is they, for example, in whip, just completely neglect one extension. They just don't do anything with it. And as a judge, I'm like, okay, then I don't care about this extension because you don't explain why I care. You don't explain how this links compared to everything everyone else has done, all that kind of stuff. And as you will see, I will try to push a couple of birds that you should do on the extension side, which is just explain why you're new, explain how you weigh over all this kind of stuff. And you simply don't have the time to do that and also do rebuttal if you try to bring two or three extensions. So in general, try to bring one extension because sometimes that will be already just enough to win. Just pick the one that's the strongest in your mind and just put all your eggs in that basket rather than try to branch out into like five or two or three or whatever. So what are the things that you can do with many impacts? So the idea of many impacts is just relatively simple. It's just you try to do a lot of generic things that could happen to a specific person. You try to think of like what are a lot of impacts you could take. This is very easy and should be done in beginning of prep time. And this is also something you can definitely exercise relatively easily. So for example, you can just pick a motion and you can think of what are the generic things that are happening here. So if you have, for example, parents motions, there are a lot of things that you can inherently talk about, right? So for example, parents oftentimes have a lot of like anxiety of making sure they're doing the best for the kid, but also can really, create their own burnouts because of the fact that they are like, have a lack of sleep, all this kind of stuff. So for example, you can already have how will this like, I don't know, parenting motion impact that specific kind. Similarly, there are always generic things on like child development, right? So it's like, will the child be happy? Will they have more opportunities? Will they have, better maybe social skills? All those kinds of things. And those are kind of like things that you could already think about and that kind of stuff. And I think this is also when you, for example, do debates a couple of times and you see, for example, also more high-end debates, you will see what other people will be talking about and what other impacts you can have on these generic things. So in general, this is a skill you could relatively easily learn by yourself as well. What then are other ways to kind of like come up with many impacts is just pick a couple of examples in the info slide. This is kind of like a pet peeve, but oftentimes they are just added there to give you some idea of clarity. Then pick those examples and think of how does this motion impact either these people or this specific aspect of it. And then think of what we, for example, a new example that is not in the info slide. If you're closing half, you have a couple of minutes and a lot of time to actually think of this because opening half will just stress out and pick those examples. Thinking of new examples, which will be in the line of or are very clearly something that could be linked to it, will be always a good way because opening half will have less time to think of these kinds of things. Another thing that is just important is just think of a lot of different actors. So sometimes you get stuck, right? So like sometimes you have emotion and you're like, I have no idea why I should care about this or what the impacts are. Then what you can do is you can go through a couple of generic groups. So what you do can, for example, pick generic actors. So you can say, how does this influence rich people? How does this influence poor people? What are the specific issues that they have related to this motion? And how could this potentially be solved by this motion? Try to think of like different people as well. So it's like, for example, people who are academic, politicians, researchers, journalists, or activists, those kinds of people, how would they be influenced by this, and how are they going to get maybe benefits or negatives from this motion? Another thing is try to just think of very different sectors. So sometimes you'll just hear emotion and you're like, okay, I'm going to think about politics. And you're going to think about politics because emotion is politics. But oftentimes, politics also has a lot of very clear impact on, for example, how easy it is for social movements to exist in the first place. Or even just economics, right? Political choices clearly have economic impacts of like how investors see the country, how easy they will be able to do their economic activities, all that kind of stuff. And here you can again differentiate. So you can think about you have these really big companies, so maybe like something like Deloitte or like PwC or like ASML, which are like multi-billion companies. Or you can think about like maybe small scale. So like your local grocery shop, you're kind of like people who are like have their pop-up stores, all those kinds of things. And you can think about how will they be impacted by stability or instability or whatever's going to happen politically. And I think here again you can just in this way by just making it very like structured in this way by going through these different things you can come up with new impacts. Other general things you could say like a feminist extension, so how this specifically impact maybe women, or you could think about developing nations. They oftentimes have the specific issues, how this motion maybe solve those issues, or will the impact be larger in these areas, those kinds of things. So that's just the kind of like core idea. This is still relatively abstract, so I'm going to give you an example of motion. So this is a motion from Princeton IV, and it has an info slide. So I'll just read out the info slide, read out the motions, and then I'll give you just like a minute, 2 minutes to maybe think of different impacts that you thought of yourself. So it's urban beautification refers to citywide initiatives that enhance the visual and physical appearance of urban spaces through projects including but not limited to landscaping, street cleaning, infrastructure upgrades, the reorganization of public spaces, and development of informal settlements. And the motion is in rapidly growing cities in less economically developed countries, this house supports beautification projects. Now just take a minute or two to just think about the different impacts. So I don't have the exact time right now, but I think I've given you roughly enough time as how much you would do in prep time. And let me show you the examples of the things I had based on this motion. So I think you can just go for a couple of things, right? So a thing you can talk about for like less economically developed countries can be, for example, economic impacts. And I can think about things, for example, lacking jobs. And then the thing that I can think about is how do you solve that? There can be different mechanisms by, for example, you get more investments because you signal more development, you make things easier, all the kind of stuff, but also maybe tourism because things look nicer. But there are also other things. So, for example, if you think about like urban planning, a very general thing of what urban planning does, it determines how easy it is, for example, communities to exist. So, if, for example, there are football places, this oftentimes means that there's more people who can, again, do sports, come together. If you create places where communities can gather, for example, to drink coffee or tea, or like, for example, host like cookouts, all those kinds of things, then you can have more communities that create from this. Other things which are just specific to the context, you have less economically developed countries. You could think about issues here about a lack of safety. You could talk about a general lack of maybe trust in the government and municipalities and all these kinds of things. And you could think just from those places, potentially this could be solved by this specific motion. Um, Another thing, and this is just again just looking at the info slides, is like having clean streets, having things like landscaping. There are a lot of health benefits from this. So you could say, in China you have Beijing, which has, very terrible like air pollution with like smog, where kids cannot go outside during school time, if the specific levels of like smog is too high, and they have like a meter on that there, and they determine that way if they can go outside. Similarly, one of the issues with climate change is summers get really hot, but also oftentimes in cities where there's no green areas, what happens is light gets reflected from areas, and there's nothing really to absorb that heat. That oftentimes get really cooked. So, for example, houses become very warm, the cities become very warm to walk in. But if you just have a couple of parks, that already gets helped. All those kinds of things. And there's also, of course, a very low like hanging fruit, which is just it is nice to live in a nicer looking city. So I don't know if you've been to cities like Belgrade or Warsaw. They have like very ugly city centers. They have very ugly things, and maybe aren't the nicest places is. But then most of you went maybe to Copenhagen, or you live in Glasgow, which has like nice old buildings, which maybe influences the way that you just go outside, how nice it is to live there, all of these kinds of things. So these are kind of like a lot of different impacts that you can claim. So this is just a great example of this. And of course, now I say, okay, you have all of these impacts, but I'm not giving you any idea how do you place this as an extension. So how would you actually do that? I'm going to give you an example. Let's just say this is based on the motion on the round I judged. So in OG, you had Oxford team, and they basically ran a lot of things. And it was really good to show kind of like, here's how you can bring an extension if they run a lot of things. So they say a lot of smaller impacts. For example, they talk about things like jobs via tourism and building projects. They talk about a lot of the things that I said about having a clean air, about how this actually is very good also to fight climate change and kind of like very hot summers, making people happier to live there, and all of these kinds of things. And there was just a lot of impacts that they ran. They ran them all well. So just again, you can assume that these things are proven. But even if you have these things, there are still a lot of ways that you can just do an analytical extension or just a horizontal extension. So for example, let's say, again, because they bring so many things, they can't prove every single claim and every single mechanism. So what you should do is when you're bringing, for example, an analytical extension, you could say, okay, they don't talk about investment as much. Maybe they have one sentence or two sentences on this. So what you then could think of is think, okay, you have these investments, they don't talk about it. I'm going to explain why the investments are going to happen so much more. So you could say the more attractiveness, the more stability you're going to be able to create, the inherent benefits for investors to invest now, like first movers advantage, all of these kinds of things. And then why there are a lot of benefits. For example, better infrastructure means traveling is cheaper, you have a larger group of people you can go into, all of these kinds of things. And then this is also important. You can explain with new reasons why these extra economic impacts are important, right? So again, if people go broad, they'll just say, you'll create jobs and that creates food and all of this kind of stuff. I think you can say again, this is nice, but you can say again, there are other benefits for creating jobs. You could say it creates a lot of like social mobility, especially for poor areas. You could say that, for example, it creates a lot more goods and services fulfilling needs that people might have that would otherwise not be accessible. So you could say, for example, there are way more bookstores, which allows individuals to better get access to university books, so that it might be easier and cheaper for them to get access to the education that they want, or health benefits when there's, for example, more chiropractors in the city, because it means that you're able to solve a lot of issues more. And it's also important is then just the weighing metric. So when you think of an analytical extension, you should do a couple of things. Not just say, I have this new impact, but already in prep time, you can think of what are the inherent benefits of this compared to the other things. So if I think of investments, I can think of this as, for example, more long term, right? So you could say tourism is seasonal or tends to be seasonal. I could think about investments because there's maybe knock-on effect, which opening half may not talk about. You could say we talk about a larger group that's being affected. And I think here this can happen in two ways, which is either one, you weigh why your specific mechanism is better, right? So the mechanism that I'm giving right now, or like the weighings, is why investment is a better mechanism for economic growth than tourism. Or I can say that the specific new impacts that I'm talking about are more important. So I could say, for example, yes, having a job and having more money is good, but you need to explain why it creates more meaning in people's life. So we're actually able to ascertain more meaning in individual life, which is a more important impact than just things like, having more money, which is still relatively abstract in opening government. Those are kind of like two ways to weigh those analytical extensions from closing to opening. Another thing is when you've gone quite wide, then you can just come up with new examples, right? So let's say you feel like opening half touches on investments, maybe doesn't just enough, and you are unable to really think of an easy impact that you can also claim outside of that to kind of like way. Making that wide is something that you could do quite well. So for example, you could say creating communities, favelas, all these kind of stuff. These are definitely things that are clearly new. And if you bring one of them, you're able to really focus on why this impact matters. So illustrate it to me. How large is this group? How severe is this impact? Are there knock-on effects when these things are solved? All of that kind of stuff. And another thing is, for example, this is what that like my closing government tried to do in this case is they tried to focus on you just have a general lack of trust in government and municipalities, and then they tried to say that this is a specific way in which you're able to resolve this issue. But the main mechanism that they had was that it was very close. So you see, for example, urban planning, you see that there now is a cleaner street, and therefore you see the action taken by the government. This was in the end then rebutted by there might be other alternatives, and the benefit of actually going wide on this impact is you're able to combine these things, right? So if there are more points you could talk about, like for example, there might be some forms of safety that will happen, or some more Catholic music create, and why this creates a positive feedback loop then to, for example, more trust in towards the government, then this may be a larger scale impact that you're able to get by thinking about more different impacts you can also claim along the way. Uh-huh. So again, last thing is oftentimes there are very few teams who are able to do three impacts very well in opening. So let's just say that again you have your opening half, which is able to do three impacts. Oftentimes there is just a breadth for analytical extensions, and the way to kind of like do this is like a mental easy thing for you to do to determine whether it's possible and which case it's possible is just think about how much time are they spending on each point, right? So if someone is spending like 4 minutes in like PM explaining a specific mechanism of the economy and why it's going to be helped. And then the DPM spends like 2 minutes weighing and impacting that, but then only has maybe 1 minute or even 30 seconds of weighing on the thing of like health impacts. Then you could just already think of that. That is where I'm going to analytically extend. Um, and also, if there is just a horizontal extension that is good enough, like, none of these cases are super duper whack that they are very uncertain or very hard to prove. In general, I would suggest try to go for a horizontal extension because then you don't need to differentiate yourself as much from your opening half. And it means that you have just more time for you to weigh why the impact's important. You have more time to impact it, all the kind of stuff. And judges are less likely to just tell you that you are derivative, or again, if you mistract something in the opening half, then you're not going to be punished as much from that. So, are there any specific questions so far on just the many impacts case? Good. Oftentimes, what also will help is oftentimes with the motions that you struggle the most are motions where you have oftentimes a hard time thinking of the different impacts. Trying to catalog for yourself which of these motions are and just ask CAs after the tournament or you're during the tournament. I had this round. I had no idea for extensions or for impacts. What else could you run? Or just ask, can you just show me the testing of the motion? And then that will also slowly allow you to unpack a couple of the benefits that you're going to get here. So another thing is a better incentive/capacity. So I think this is a slightly more advanced way to come up with an analytical extension. So let's say, for example, your opening half is just saying this will be implemented because we have fiat, or there's like just implicit from the motion that this will happen. So for example, the last motion it was this house believes that X should Y, so you just have fiat to say this is how it will happen. So what you can do is, let's say you can't really think of anything horizontal, like you can only think of just the same impacts your opening half talks about. Then you can exploit this gap if opening half doesn't talk about it to then explain how you are going to get better access to the analytical impact. The other thing that you can think about is sometimes the opposition teams will just point out, right? So they say, okay, sure, you wanted this plan, but there might be corruption. There might be other issues. And even if they don't do this to the full extent, you could say there may be still more doubts, or still a larger skill impact that we can get from proving why you have the better incentive and capacity, and therefore we're going to do that. So again, here's another example, is the same motion. So we're just going to have the same idea. And here again, I want you to take maybe 1 minute to just think about how can I prove on the government side that you have good incentives or good capacity to do this. Um, Okay, that's roughly 1 minute, maybe just slightly less. And I'll show you again what I just tried to come up with. So here, when you do incentive and capacity analysis, incentives is kind of like you could say there are a lot of inherent benefits for politicians when they live in these areas as well. So they live in a nice city, whereas building maybe some more further away projects like even hospitals, all this kind of stuff, doesn't really influence them as directly. You could say there's maybe more accountability, especially for example, richer people who are going to tend to be the ones who donate and to vote and all that kind of stuff, because they tend to live in these centers. And then again, you could say again, the reason why this is just a thing that they'll have good incentives for is that if they want to tackle a lot of issues like maybe crime, all this kind of stuff, these are benefits they can get, right? So it's easier to police these places. It's easier to have, for example, public transport in these places if the city, streets are safer and cleaner, or you also do landscaping to make the roads less windy, all of that kind of stuff. So you could say if they want to do other things, this is kind of like a good thing that they do in the first place. And again, other things, just better capacity. So they could say the reason why you're able to do this, you could say these are still, lower economically countries, so like not very developed, but they are on the rise. So you could say there's still maybe a lack of budget, but you could say rich people and like companies will donate to, for example, have their name or plaque on a park. Again, you could say again the incentive analysis, they also live in these places. They also want to have these benefits. And you could say again the reason why this is also uniquely good. You could just have a lot of like competition, right? So you could say we have a park, we have different designers. For how cheap can you do it? How like easy can you do it? And also creates a lot of like community buy-in because you're integrating the community, and therefore there's better capacity to put in these programs rather than maybe other programs, like vaccination attempts projects, because there's maybe less buy-in and more skepticism towards these plans, and there isn't as much of an direct back and forth with the community. Okay, so that's kind of like a thing you could do on sense and capacity. Now, how do you use this in an analytical extension? I think again, we just use the same example. So let's say OG has the same thing on tourism and build-up projects and all this kind of stuff. And let's say you're unable to think of the urban planning or the community side or the safety side at all, and you're unable to think of these examples for cases. Then you can only think of analytical extensions. And here you could say, for example, you're going to get investments in the area in general. But you can also say we're going to give better reasons of why there's going to be better incentive and capacity. And then you try to run a smaller parallel impact. So again, you could say, or even you say, okay, we also talk about jobs. Even if you say we don't do all of that, you could say this extension still is better than opening half. Because yes, they touch on getting more jobs, but we're able to say that these projects are going to be sustained, which is not a given in these areas. We're going to say that you're going to have more projects in the first place because you just have more money, and there's going to be more buy-in, so there's also more like less cost for upkeep because it's less likely to have vandalism and all that kind of stuff. And they could say so we're able to impact like the benefits, for example, for tourism on a way larger scale and a longer scale, and that's why we're better able to get access to the impacts. In general, I would still recommend of just having some slight different impacting or some different ideas of why economically it matters to maybe have these investments. But if you already explain why you have a larger scope or larger projects, you need to spend less time on weighing those specific impacts that you have because you just have a quicker or better path to that victory. So a certain way, you're just having a mechanistic weighing uh, extension compared to your opening half. Another thing is explain why these things matters. So don't just say we prove better incentive and capacity. There's sometimes where people just say this, and I see this in debates often, where it's say opening half has this gap, they don't do it, we fill in this gap, therefore we win the debate because we fill in the gap for opening half. And oftentimes what they also tend to do is they just are not charitable to the opening. So the opening might have some implicit material on this, or just has fiat, or they already have ideas on why this is a implementable idea. So don't try to say they never explain this, they therefore are unable to get any impacts or ignore the analysis. So ways to, for example, explain this is, look, we explain why we help way more people in a larger group. This is more important because this also means that we're more likely to reach the more vulnerable in the society, or we're able to explain why this impact fulfills maybe the social contract best because we're fulfilling the social contract to more people, and therefore we're able to have a better case than just the things that opening half talks about. So again, just meta reasons why helping more people is a more important thing than what your opening half does. Are there any questions on just this form of analytical extensions? Okay, great. Then now to the last thing. This is not necessarily a way of just how do I find extensions? It is to a certain extent, but this is also a mental shortcut that you can create for yourself to say, how am I going to place my extension? So, for example, you're going to listen to what your opening does, and then you go for the exact opposite kind of impact. So, for example, you can just look explicitly, right? So, are they going to go for very large and therefore maybe more uncertain impacts? Or are they going for small and therefore more certain impacts? So then you can say, okay, they really talk about just the small impacts. Can we maybe think of something large scale that we can impact? Something else you could do is like think implicitly and listen to what they are implicitly saying. So if they talk, for example, about specific regions or specific things, are they, for example, talking about the rich city center? Are they examples that they give, Beijing, which is still from a developing or country which is on the rise, or are they using examples from other places like maybe London or Dublin or Glasgow, which are in more developed regions? But also, do they focus on poor people? Do they focus on rich people? Do they focus on the middle class? Do they focus on other people that you could maybe focus on? Men, women, all these kinds of things. And again, also, this is another general thing you could ask yourself is, do they focus on the benefit of what they need to do? And do they, for example, not focus on the negatives of not doing the policy? So sometimes this is very clear, right? So it's like this house prefers X to do Y versus Z. And if the team just really explains what the benefits are Y, then an extension can be what here are all the negatives of Z. But there's also ways where even if that's not the case, you can still explain why it's a harm to not do it or not implement this motion, especially now. So let's again go to the exact same motion. So you could say you have smaller impacts, right? So jobs for tourism, which again maybe not maybe as big of a project as maybe other impacts you want to run, clean air, all the kind of stuff. And then you could say, okay, well, how does this new context, right? So you could say in poor cities, what is something that they don't talk about? So if the examples that they give are things like Dublin and London, you could say a lot of like specific issues that these places have is a lack of safety. So you could, for example, talk about favelas, or you could talk about policing in the streets and how hard this kind of stuff. Or you could say the benefits that they talk about may mainly affect men or just some general group, but maybe a lot of issues, for example, for women, is that they feel unsafe or unable to participate in these cities because of the way they're structured, and then you're able to overcome these issues. Another thing is again, these impacts might be somewhat smaller. So yes, you maybe get jobs from tourism, and yes, you maybe get health benefits, but these are necessarily maybe not as large as maybe other things you could talk about. There's, for example, trust in the government, which you could say has a lot of impacts because you talk about like the vaccine programs, the willingness to people to participate in those, but also in handouts, if they are going to opt in for education programs, they believe they're going to be represented, all of that kind of stuff. Um, Another thing, and this kind of like the third example, is just why now, right? So what is the harm of not doing these things now? So you could say, for example, there are a lot of harms that can happen besides what opening half talks about. So you could talk maybe specifically about smog or about water pollution, all these kinds of things. But you could say you need to do it now because once you don't do it, people become dependent on the current infrastructure, and it's going to be way more expensive to do it later. And it's going to be way harder to do later because you're going to have so much more inertia from companies, from people who already live there, who are going to be now richer, all these kinds of things. And therefore, you basically need to do it now. So there's a harm in not pursuing the policy that's going to accrue. Um, yeah, so this is again the general things that I would say for your opening. Um, okay, that is the main thing I want to talk about for this one. Again, a lot of this most likely will come somewhat intuitive. Like, of course, you need to think of why. But I hope what you try to get at with this workshop is one, what are the ways for me to get to these wide impacts? Two, how do I place them, right? So there are a lot of times just shortcuts you could give yourself. How often or how long are people talking about the issue in the opening half? If they're spending 1 minute on it, most likely the case is not proven. But also, just listen implicitly, explicitly. Where are they talking about and what are they doing? And how can we maybe do the opposite to kind of like create a new case? And I think those are all ways in which you can think of new extensions, but also place your extensions. So you can explain why these are new, but also why they are more important. Again, yeah, so those are the things. We're kind of like short on time, but I think there's still, again, more questions. If you have them about this part, you can ask them, or if you have general questions about extensions or general things I've said in this workshop, you can ask them now. I hope that this meant that the workshop was clear and not that I was very unclear. I think now might be the best time to just take a break because I already have a motion ready, and afterwards I can judge one of the rounds or one of the rooms.